Live from the World Bank Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. to an audience across the globe, I'm Paul Blake, and it's day 4 of the 2020 annual meetings. And Moments will be connected to all corners of the world as the focus today turns to digital development. But first, let's get across the online conversation with Pabsi Mariano. Pabsi, day 4, all about digital development, but the previous 3 days have focused on debt, sustainability, and human capital. Was yesterday. You've been across the conversation all week. What are some of the highlights?
Basically, the conversation is just landing on the key themes of our key events. So obviously, there's really a call for supporting a resilient recovery, especially nowadays. So just keep on doing that, guys. Participate, use our hashtags. And just a reminder that all of these events are being streamed in languages. So we have French, Arabic, and Spanish as well. So keep checking World Bank Live.
So if English isn't your primary language, you have some options there to be watching in your language. This event coming up today, as I said, about digital development, there's also going to be a special musical performance. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so now more than ever, of course, collaboration and connectivity is important, right? So we will have a musical tribute from incredible artists from Africa. I don't want to spoil it too much, so that's something to look forward.
Custom produced for this event
for
today.
The annual meetings, exactly.
That's really cool. And I understand the artists are from across the continent.
Yeah, different countries.
That's really cool. So all came together online. That's super, super cool. You've had polls running all week. The poll today will be about digital development. Where can people vote on that?
So it's across all our platforms, but of course the easiest way is to go to World Bank Live, so live.worldbank.org, go to the event page. The poll is right there on the page, but again, if you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, you can answer the poll there too.
Perfect. Another question for you, in terms of being across the conversation, if you're not on the live blogs on World Bank Live, what's the hashtag to talk about today's event, to get in on the conversation? So
people can use the hashtag connectivity for all, and of course, our hashtag for the whole meetings, resilient recovery.
And we'll have you back at towards the end of the program today to talk about the digital art project. Just briefly, we've got about 15 or 20 seconds. Tell us about how we can contribute to that.
Yeah, so please go to live.worldbank.org/mosaic and upload your photo there about resilience. It's looking pretty cool.
Awesome, thanks, Pabsi. All right, well, we are just moments away from the first event, all about the digital divide and digital development. We'll be back here at 11:10 a.m. with Pabsi. That's 15:10 GMT, alongside an expert panel of guests, including the IFC's Stephanie von Friedeberg and World Bank's Mokhtar Diop, to answer your questions. So be sure to submit those on World Bank Live. But now it's time to turn our focus to digital development. So let me hand it over to the BBC's Lerato Mbele in Johannesburg, South Africa. Lerato, take it away.
The warmest welcome to this virtual summit titled Closing the Digital Divide. It forms part of the annual meetings of the World Bank Group. Now, it's no accident that we're having a conversation virtually. It's par for the course in a world that's been ravaged by COVID-19. And indeed, what it has done is force half of the world's population and businesses to migrate online. However, what 2020 has also taught us is that reliable and affordable connectivity is hard to come by. And indeed, it has shone the spotlight on the fact that there's more than half of the world's population, in fact, 3.6 billion people, who have not been able to participate in this new digital economy. And so in today's conversation, we're going to be speaking to a group of illustrious speakers who are going to talk us through some of the challenges and indeed the solutions that will ensure that the world's most vulnerable, the world's poorest, are able to join in this new technologically advanced economy. Research shows that of the 25 nations in the world that have the least connectivity, about 21 of them are found right here on the African continent, where I live and work. And so if we're looking for a world that has greater equity, greater engagement, and greater connectivity, we must ensure that Africa is not left behind. And this conversation is going to show us different ways in which we can navigate and rise above some of these limitations. Here's a look at what's coming up. So obviously there's a lot to look forward to, but here's how you can participate in what we hope will be an interactive session. Firstly, note that the event is being live streamed in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic on the World Bank Live page. You can participate, share your views, your comments using the hashtag #ConnectivityForAll. There'll also be a few polls that we conduct during the session. Make sure that you participate and stay engaged. And then when you want to raise your questions, we will be having a bonus session at the end, which will be hosted by Makta Diop, who is the Vice President in charge of infrastructure at the World Bank, and he'll be joined by Stephanie van Freudenberg, who is the Acting Chief Executive at the IFC, and together they'll be taking your questions in real time and answering whatever are your concerns and engaging you further. Now, as we said, the session today is focused on closing the digital divide. And so it's really apt that we begin our conversation with two gentlemen whose commitment is towards eradicating poverty and modernizing economies in a way that really empowers all of us to participate in this new digital world. It is the president of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, joined by Sundar Pichai, who's the chief executive of Google and Alphabet. Thank you so much to you, President David Malpass, for joining us, and Sundar Pichai for joining us in this fireside chat, which will set the tone for all the discussions we're having today about digital connectivity. Permit me to begin with you, David Malpass. Why do you think it is so important in the current economic and social context to be talking about digital connectivity, but also why has it been so difficult to implement it?
The research shows that a correlation between growth and improvements in connectivity is huge. So if we can get more people connected, we can see countries do better. The median income can go up, and that's what it's all about. That helps us if we can get lower cost transactions that can occur, and that gets right into digital connectivity. That means the backbone of the system, also the electricity. Its starting point for all of this is electricity and the need to move forward on rural areas. In Kenya, we've got 3/4 of the population using digital money. That's huge because it brings down the cost of transaction, come down, and people that are on the margins can get into the economy. And that's a fabulous force multiplier. Productivity that economists talk about goes up when that happens. In Nigeria, there's real-time prices for crops, and information turns out to be vitally important. And we also have the targeting of safety nets so that if money can go to people that really are in need, then it spreads throughout the economy. So in COVID-19, it's all the more important, being connected, and people that don't have broadband are left out, left behind. This gets into the education system, and we've really got a huge job in front.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the context in which we find ourselves in 2020. It's been a challenging year, and particularly challenging for countries in the developing world. I'm in South Africa, as you know, and although the country has made great strides in creating a digital economy, unfortunately, it hasn't been affordable and accessible to all. There's a huge inequality issue in this country. There's high unemployment, and that in itself compounds the issue of the digital divide. With that, I'd like to bring you into the conversation, Sundar, and ask you what needs to be done to connect the unconnected? And more than that, what needs to be done and what can a company such as yours do to really harness this internet economy on the continent?
Thank you, Lerato, to the World Bank, President Malpass, for the invite and the opportunity today. Connectivity is actually deeply personal to me. It's been a passion growing up in India. I had to wait a lot to get connectivity. The first way I used telephone was by waiting in lines in these shared spaces, and we would all share a telephone. It took 5 years to get a rotary phone, but it really changed our lives. And so, to your point, Lerato, making this inclusive is one of the most important things we can do. And if anything, COVID and the pandemic has reinforced what access to technology means. We need to make, globally, we have made big strides in connectivity and access to mobile across the world, but a lot of work remains. Digital broadband penetration in Africa, it's about 18% of households. So I think few things we can do. In terms of investing in infrastructure, one of the projects we have underway, last year we introduced a subsea cable starting in Western Europe, running along the west coast of Africa, from Portugal to South Africa, with branching units along the way. We hope we can use things like that to extend connectivity to more African countries in future. We need to do all this in a pro-competitive way. Bringing connectivity, I think, is critical. And so, we need to be innovative here. We are talking about digital connectivity. I think an important aspect of that we are focused on is financial connectivity too, and access to payments and your ability to participate in the economic system is important. 1.7 billion people are underbanked around the world. So we are doing a lot of work. We are very excited in our partnership with the Mojalo Foundation. They're obviously investing in open source, real-time interoperable payment systems. We have a lot of experience having done this in India based on the UPI system set up there, sponsored by the government, the National Payments Council, and the Reserve Bank of India. And so, and we see the benefit. We see the way transactions increased when we did that. And, it's a huge opportunity, I think. So that's another important way by which we can provide connectivity from an infrastructure standpoint.
Well, that sounds fantastic, and we're really excited here when we hear about the internet balloons that are flying over the skies of East Africa, set up by Google. So infrastructure is really key. But David, one of the things that tech companies often complain about is the challenging regulatory environment, and not just in places like Africa, but the world over, as we're seeing at the moment. What are your views on dealing with regulators, and what's one way of overcoming it?
It's a host of problems. On the electricity side, often regulation is an obstacle to having 24/7 power. So that's a start. There needs to be some kind of open infrastructure investment process, which I've pushed hard on the transparency side. That can help a lot. We also need independent regulators for various markets and countries. That's a critical part of getting the costs down. And over and over again, the call it monopoly power becomes an obstacle, and the regulators can't get through it. There's just not a way to break through vested interests. So I did want to ask Sundar who about the fiber, the cable under West Africa. Are you able to get it on land? Can it come into the continent? And what are some of the challenges in bringing broadband, truly broadband, I suppose you're able to bring in? What are the problems in getting that done?
No, it's a great question. We obviously are focused on the subsea cable, and we're building in the option value with branching units. Anytime we need to do something beyond that, we obviously, as Google, we partner. We are not in the underlying telco business, but we partner with telcos across the continent. A lot of times the challenges are, the capex that is needed and doing it in a certain environment when if people invest that, they can see the returns back. And I think, you mentioned this earlier in our other conversations, but I think making sure there's a pro-innovative, pro-competitive environment in which companies can invest, I think is equally important as we think through these things.
So, David, for you, partnerships are really important. I guess my question is to Sundar, which is, how do you leverage these partnerships to achieve success for digital connectivity? What does that success look like in terms of the future you imagine, and how would you measure it as well?
In terms of, we are working on, measurement is really important. We appreciate the partnership with the World Bank. We're really grateful to be part of the Digital Partnerships Initiative. And we are working on what we call as digital sprinter reports, effectively a report card with data and how how there is progress. But there is a lot of work underway, and I'm super excited about all the stuff we are doing.
And David, for you, thoughts on how best to really actualize some of these partnerships for this future that we imagine?
We try to find countries where there's receptivity where we can do that. For example, in Jordan, the government's opening a national broadband network so it creates affordable fiber broadband. And in other countries, we are trying to do that as well. It requires the legal foundation, as we were discussing before, and also electricity, the access to fiber optics, all of the building blocks, so that these can be built. And you know, then the top end, or is the software and the applications, the digital, the financial interaction that makes it all profitable or allows countries to keep building these networks. That's what we're trying to achieve.
And then, gentlemen, just as a final consideration, we have referenced the fact that 2020 was a year with many aberrations, complexities, that were really created by the spread of COVID-19. As we plot and think about the post-COVID world and the momentum that's been created around really utilizing digital tools at work, at home, in education and healthcare, how do we build on this momentum, both within the development finance space and within the corporate space, to harness these partnerships and to really accelerate this future of digital connectivity?
If I could, a couple of things, maybe worth touching on as we've talked about digital connectivity. Digital connectivity is just a foundation, right? And it's very important to take your population and make sure they are digitally skilled. And so digital skilling is an important next step. At Google, we've been doing a lot of initiatives. We've committed in Africa. We have trained 5 million Africans. Around the world, in Latin America, we have IT certification programs. And similarly, we have programs underway in Asia as well. But I think it's really important, and there are basic skills which the population needs to transition and take advantage of that. It also goes to small, medium businesses. They are the engine of any economy. And making sure SMBs have the tools they need. I think investment there is important. Education is important. And finally, for entrepreneurs, I think it's important to invest in entrepreneurs, and that's very, very critical. A couple of things Google is doing. We have the Training Africa program. We are training 100K developers on mobile technologies and platforms. We have an accelerator for startups in Africa and Southeast Asia. And there are over 130 plus startups with 500 founders we are involved with. And we are ready to work more with World Bank and countries in all these areas, be it digital skilling, tools for SMBs, education, and investing in an innovation ecosystem. And to your starting point, we need to do this and make sure digital is sustainable, it's inclusive, and so there's a lot of work left, I think.
And final thoughts from you, David? We
need to have lots more conversations. I think there's good roles for public sector, for private sector in making this all work. And I'm interested also in the metrics themselves, helping us keep track of the progress being made. One way to do it is the volume of transactions, the low cost of transactions. So, if we could have 1 billion transactions in a country at a very low cost, that would be huge, because then that opens all these new avenues. So let's keep working on it in every area. I think it's really valuable.
I think there's a lot to be optimistic and hopeful about. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, David and Sundar.
I'm Anne Margalio in Manila, Philippines, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Annual Meetings.
Well, it's a great conversation taking place there between David Malpass and Sundar Pichai, talking about the importance of partnerships between the public and private sectors, and the fact that there are opportunities all around us. And indeed, we're seeing that in the emerging digital economy here on the African continent, as young entrepreneurs and self-starters use technology not just to solve problems, but to disrupt existing parts of the traditional African economy, really helping to transform the landscape here. Let's hear from them as they sit on the precipice of change.
I'm doing this because I feel personally really passionate about being part of the solution.
In logistics, in power, in mobility, in banking.
Basic needs industries like food,
e-learning, fintech, animation and gaming.
Infrastructure, transport, payments, commerce.
What startups do, they disrupt a certain industry that's already been there.
And it being so early still and relatively small means that there are obviously lots of opportunities for new types of businesses.
Africa skipped the landlines, right? So they went to mobile right away. We have to do the exact same thing in power, in logistics, distribution, in transportation and mobility, in access to internet and access to power.
This is a very, very exciting time, especially as mobile phone networks continue to roll out 4G technology. Essentially just opens up a very, very significant opportunity across the continent.
We're in a phase where a lot of the infrastructure is being built. I think the key though is to try not just to copy and paste what has worked in other regions.
The model that Africa should continue is an innovation that can be exported to other emerging markets, because that is why our companies become profitable.
Talent infrastructure, that's really what I want to dedicate my life for, maybe another 5 to 10 years to see where Gabea goes.
IFC and Google and other people that are really invested in trying to see how to lift Africa from poverty through entrepreneurship and innovation. They're telling our story to Africa and to the rest of the world.
It's a really, really great time to be in the continent.
There are obviously lots of opportunities for new types of businesses.
Africa.
Sustainable
entrepreneurship.
Africa.
Innovation.
Transformative change.
Africa.
So if you headed a venture fund, right, where would you put your money? Right now, it's in Africa, yeah.
Those are fantastic views coming from 6 African entrepreneurs who show that technology enhances their creativity, but more importantly, it ensures that the provision of basic public services can be a little more efficient. Now, if you're interested to find out how some of these entrepreneurs are being supported, please visit the IFC website and join the conversation on #IFC Impact. Now, here's a real opportunity for you to participate and tell us what you think the best solutions ought to be. Our poll question for you is, what do you think is most needed to close the digital divide? Is it infrastructure investments, technological innovation, better policies and regulations, or digital skills? You can cast your vote on the World Bank Live page and also stay tuned for the results, which will come up straight after the event. Now, when we talk about the figures around global connectivity, unfortunately, we've been told that women are less likely than men to have access to the internet. And so it's fair to say that there's somewhat of a gender bias when we discuss the subject of the digital economy. Reshma Sojani is the founder of Girls Who Code. It's a nonprofit organization, and their aim is to completely close the gender gap in technology. Let's hear from her as she gives us a call to action.
Hi, everyone. I'm Reshma Sojani, the founder and CEO of Girls Who Code. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the World Bank for organizing this incredible virtual conference. It's an honor to be here, to be talking about the digital divide, about technology, who has access to it, and more importantly, who doesn't. I remember a decade ago when I first founded Girls Who Code, almost no one was talking about the digital divide or the gender gap in tech. Back then, women made up less than a quarter of the global tech workforce. Unfortunately, that's still true today. Women and girls are still being left out of the fastest growing and highest paying jobs in the global economy. Just last year, people in programming jobs in the US made twice what the average American makes. These were jobs that could lift up an entire families and communities up into the middle class. As a daughter of refugees who cares deeply about giving back to this country and the world, I knew I had to do something to bring more girls into the field. So I started Girls Who Code. I bought the URL, borrowed some office space, and recruited 20 girls for our first ever program in New York. Nearly 10 years later, we have reached 500 million people through our work and taught 300,000 girls through our in-person programming. Our girls are majoring in computer science at a rate of 15 times the national average. And we're on track to close the gender gap in entry-level tech jobs in the US by 2027. It's true that with the spread of COVID-19, we're up against a new challenge this year, a new setback. But this setback should only strengthen our resolve to reach girls, to bring them into this industry. And as part of that work, we must close the digital divide. 300 million fewer women than men in low and middle income countries have access to the mobile internet. That's roughly the population of the United States. We need our girls, all of our girls, to have access to tech. And more than that, a shot at working in tech. Because when they do, they'll change the world. I know, because I've seen our Girls Who Code alumni at work. Take Natalia, for instance. She's undocumented and working as a web developer on a film about immigration laws and how they affect families like hers. Or Haley. She loves to play the violin. And then she realized how expensive instruments are. So she coded a database where families could sell or rent their instruments at a cheaper price. And then there's Karina, who started Makers for COVID-19, a coalition of 3D printers who've made thousands of units of PPE for frontline workers fighting COVID. These girls are truly incredible. I always say that the gender gap in tech, the digital divide, is a problem that we can solve in our lifetime. That's rare. And if we give girls the skills they need to code, we'll be solving more than just one problem. Because our girls won't just be coders. They'll be inventors, scientists, astronauts. They'll be surgeons, architects, legislators. They will be leaders. They will be healers. They will be revolutionaries. Together, we can bring this world to bear for our girls, our communities, and our world. Thank you.
Well, that's a call to action from Reshma Saujani, who's the Chief Executive of Girls Who Code. It's quite an inspirational message as well. As you well know, the theme of the annual meetings is resilient recovery, and we want to know what resilience means to you. We'd like you to showcase it, as it were, by taking a selfie of what resilience means to you, and eventually we'll put it all together in unity of purpose to get a snapshot of what the world's interpretation is, and this can be done on this particular website.
I'm Abibatu Bologo in Bamako, Mali. Welcome to the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Well, it's now time for us to delve further into the topic around closing the digital divide and talking through some of the challenges that have been experienced, especially at the policymaking level. Are Pamela GD, who is the Vice Minister for Telecommunications in Chile. She's joined by Sigve Brekke, who is the Chief Executive of Telenor in Oslo, Norway, and leading this conversation is the President of the World Bank himself, David Malpass. David, over to you.
Thank you, Lorado. Over the next few minutes, we're going to examine the challenges, but also look for ideas and solutions, joining both the public and private sector, some of the key players in digital connectivity. So let's begin with Pamela Gidi. She's Vice Minister of Telecommunications of Chile and has been a leading voice in advocating universal connectivity. So Pamela, can I ask you, what were some of the key regulations and steps that you were able to take to bring up the connectivity rate in Chile? What were the challenges and how'd you get through them?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon to all. Closing the digital gap is one of our main goals of this government, especially now that the pandemic has shown the inequality, and that also have shown that only is possible to work remotely and study remotely with a very good connection, not just a connection. We are thinking and working to double the kilometers of fiber optic in Chile. We have a very good penetration of internet if we consider both fixed and mobile technologies, almost 90%, but we have a big gap in fixed broadband access. In fact, 30 percentage points under Europe, and that's our goal. What are we doing? We are doubling the kilometers of fiber optic, and that we're working with the private industry to promote all the regulations, facilitate the time of deployment. But also we are conducting in the last 2-3 years, the two biggest subsidies to almost 60% of the municipalities in Chile to build the backbone, backbone of fiber optic. These together with projects with the regional governments to build last mile. So we are reaching almost like 5 million people out of 17 million people that were having very low connection. In Chile, it's a very disparity. There's some municipalities that have almost 100% of connectivity, fixed broadband, and there's many others, in fact, 50 that has less than 1%. So we are focusing obviously in the less connected. The problem is that even though as a regional government, we have the money for the backbone, we are facing many problems in get the money for the more than 60 projects for the last mile. So what are we doing? We also, it's very important to mention that we are also providing state subsidies to more 10,000 educational establishments that represents more than 98% of the Chilean school park. Among these, more than 2,000 will have connectivity, internet for the first time starting next year. Also, we are doubling the free hotspots around Chile.
I see. So lots of steps, and in part, the government involvement was important. I spoke earlier with Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, and we discussed the involvement of the private sector and how that's done. So I wonder, in Chile, was there private sector involvement, and what did they do? How did you share that burden between public and private?
We will a table to promote public investment. We also to be clear of the things that we can do as government in terms of regulation to, for example, reduce the time of approval of concessions and permits. We have decreased that with new norms about 1/3 and facilitate all the process with digitalization, and a process is more lean and agile. We are also working with the local governments in order to facilitate all the permits, for example, to deploy all the big projects around the country, and also connecting where trying to find subsidies where it's no commercial interest or profitable for the companies to go on their own. We are providing subsidies to touch and to have connectivity for more of those vulnerable rural areas mainly. And we are also, because we need to find the rates and different alternatives, we also studying different alternatives like subsidy on demand, for example, spectrum dedicated for rural purposes. And we also have a project in the Congress to study universal internet access, and we are promoting infrastructure sharing. In fact, we have a new law that will make the 10,000 localities, towns, to have only one company with internet mobile to share their infrastructure with other companies so people are connected in those rural areas.
Very interesting. Let's bring in Sigve Brekke, the CEO of Telenor. They're a mobile telecom operator that's pioneered in a lot of emerging markets, for example, in Bangladesh, Malaysia, in Myanmar, in Pakistan, and others. And I want to get his perspective on what some of the challenges are. How were you able to do it? And how did you do it profitably? I'm very interested.
Thank you, David, and thanks for having me. Yes, we are based here in the small country of Norway, but we have made a strategy out of connecting the unconnected mainly in Asia. So today we are operating in 9 countries, 185 million customers, and among the biggest mobile operators in the world. We are operating, as you said, in markets like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Myanmar. Then answering your question, we have found a model where we are trying to make money and at the same time empowering the societies. And the way we are doing this is that we see that there is a clear linkage between connectivity and economic growth. We have even made a study on that, and we saw that for every 10% you can increase mobile connectivity and data connectivity, there is a direct impact on the GDP of 1 percentage point.
Mm-hmm.
And this is coming from basically 2 areas. One is to enable the small and medium-sized businesses to connect and with that take positions. Another area is that you use the connectivity platform to bring in services like digital financial services, health services, educational services, and so on and so forth, out in the remote villages. What we have found is that the technology and affordability is not an issue. Even financing is not an issue. The issue is very much around short-term financial objectives for the governments in some of these markets, trying to tighten their budgets with taxes and license fees. It's about unpredictable financial frameworks. It's about uneven playing field where you're trying to protect local players. And it's about also what I will call conservative regulations when it comes to, for example, opening up the banking sector or the educational sector or the health sector. So for us, and we say it in our purpose, we say connecting you to what matters most, empowering societies. So for us, this is very much about partnership. And we see that we have the same objectives. So what we are trying to do is to form these private-public partnerships, where we as a private sector go in with the government, sit down and figure out how can we combine making money and actually closing the digital divide.
And do you think that do the previous vested interests or sometimes there's monopoly power, do they have to pull back, or are you able to in effect bring them together? And what's the role of the government of the subsidies that we were hearing about, or the push from the government to go toward more universal coverage? How do you balance those various interests?
Now, as I said, we don't think this is about technology or financial issues. So we don't need any subsidies. That's not what we are after. We think we can connect even the remote villages of Pakistan or Bangladesh or Myanmar, also low-income countries, with our equipment. So what we need actually is predictable regulatory framework. We need modernized regulations. And we need governments to have investments laws that gives you an even playing field.
I'll go back to Pamela and ask, will there be a transition period in Chile where the amount of the support that goes through the education system and so on, can it be lowered? Telenor is able to connect people that we think for $2 per month. And do it with technology. Can that be done in Chile? What do you think the cost is for people in Chile right now?
It will depend of how far away these rural areas are from the backbone, right? And that's why we are studying different technologies to approach those areas. Obviously, we are also launching the first national tender for 5G. And we have a system of beauty contest, not real a tender. And the requirement there is to cover 90%, at least 90% of the population with 5G in the first 3 years, with more points if they cover in the first years. Obviously, we are looking at sharing spectrum in rural areas, satellite, all the satellite technology that is coming for internet, and obviously 5G fixed wireless. That's what we're looking, and obviously the cost always will depend in the backbone and how far away where the backbone, and we can see dramatically different costs depending on that.
Sigfie, how do you do it inexpensively from the back? What how can you respond or describe for Pamela the challenges you're facing in the Asian countries?
Yeah, just take your $2 first. We are making money out of $1.5 US per month per customer. And the way we are able to do that, it is to utilize the scale. So we are rolling out our network in all those remote villages. And we are doing that kind of the network connectivity. And we then work together with the schools, educational sector, with the finance sector, and even with the health sector, such that we can provide more type of services to the customers. And that's why I'm saying that this is not about technology or even affordability. It is about creating that partnership. And that is where we really need the government to step in. And even the World Bank, we are working together with you in many of these countries, because the challenge we actually have is to get the governments in here to sit down and say that we have the same objective, and that the private sector is not an enemy. The private sector can even be used actually to meet public objectives.
And do you break down your customers into consumers and versus small businesses? Do you make a distinction, or is it the same service?
No, we make a distinction between the consumers, and then you have the SMEs, and then you have the enterprises and the public sector on top. So those are the three main sectors. So what we do then with the governments is actually to look at how can we together work with all these three different levels, and that's very much back again to licensing, regulations, and regimes, tax regimes, and so on and so forth.
And do you charge more? Is there progressivity in the rates?
Yes and no. It is the same rate for all the consumers, regardless of where you live, if you live in Dhaka or out in a remote village. But you charge a little bit more for the SMEs and for the enterprises. But the reason you do that is that you bring more to that customer relationship than only connectivity. So you bring security solutions, for example, storage solutions, and more integrated IT solutions. So you value add, or you upsell what you're actually selling to them.
And back to Pamela, any opinion on that? Should it be the same price for the same kind of customer, or how do you think about that issue?
Yeah, well, obviously, yes, for the company and for a person privately, they're different. Like, the wallet is completely different. The thing I'm hearing what Sig is saying with a lot of envy almost, because what happened with Chile is like the geography is so difficult, so long, so thin. You have thousands of locality with less than 50 people living there. So I think the volume of connecting Chile, all the rural areas of Chile, because of the small population of the locations, is not so easy as with big markets or big population as Pakistan, for instance.
Maybe I'll close with a question to Sigfie of, are there things the World Bank can do to help? Are any country-specific issues or general issues that we could help you with?
Definitely,
well,
yes.
You are already. We are working with your team because we have the backbone already financed, but we need to have all these projects of last mile, and we are working with the World Bank team where we can find, even though the needs are very high, we have already the projects defined, how we can reach and build those last mile together with not just a financial just not making it as a financial decision, but also a development decision.
Understood. Sigve?
Yeah, just a short response to the minister. The way we do this in our market is that there is no subsidies, but we are rolling out our network even in the small villages where you have 50 population, which is not profitable. But that's a part of the regulation. And that's the benefit of sitting down with the government and figure out how can we have regulation where we are not maximizing, for example, the upfront payment on spectrum, but we are rather giving obligations to the industry to even cover those remote areas. But to your question, the main help we can get from the World Bank is to sit down with the government and actually look at that we have the same objective and how digitalization can go hand in hand with public sector and the private sector. And rather than having these short-term financial gains and unpredictable investment framework, trying to use the best practices. That's where you can come in.
This predictable regulatory structure seems to be one of the biggest interests of business. They say we can operate in lots of environments, but we need to know what the environment is and that it will last for a while, and then we can adjust. This has been very interesting. I want to thank Pamela and Sigve for a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I am Justin Manley in Antananarivo, Madagascar, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Thank you for sharing your insights there from Norway and Chile. Obviously, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and a lot of resources have been mobilized towards getting the world through COVID-19 and a lot of the repercussions that have come from there. And to that effect, 4 partners have come together to find solutions through a joint action plan. Let's take a look at some of the work that's been done.
When we think about what we would be facing right now without internet connectivity, it would be much more devastating than it currently is. In terms of ensuring access and affordability of digital services, we need to look at price reductions and discounts on capacity, airtime, and devices. And we also need to look at supporting alternative funding models for complementary access solutions.
We need to have a framework with the regulators about infrastructure sharing, also accelerating the implementation of the Universal Access Fund, and to create a condition for the private sector to continue investing to be able to connect the poorest and people in rural areas.
Many of these challenges do not need new technologies. What we need is urgent and sustained collaboration between the private sector and governments to create the right networks so that people can access and use the information and create the services that people need. That's the reason we launched the Joint Action Plan, in order to be able to provide a simple guide to governments and businesses in countries around the world as to what they can do today in order to make sure that we keep connectivity available and extend it to all of those that need it.
Working as one is critical to achieve all connected world that we're all aspiring to. With connectivity comes prosperity, comes inclusion, and comes business opportunities that the world needs right now.
Of course, that's just a sense of some of the work that's being done in partnership around connecting the unconnected. And what we've just seen there is the joint action plan that comes through from various partners in this area. Now, of course, before we talk about the solutions to bridging the digital divide, we also want to get your views on how best to do it. And we've been running a poll, and it's running right now on the World Bank Live page. And the question for you is, what's most needed to close the digital divide? Is it infrastructure investments, technological innovation? Would it be policies and regulations, or digital skills? Make sure to cast your vote and know that the final results will be revealed at the end of this session. Also, we're using the hashtag connectivity for all throughout this event. Make sure you join in the conversation.
I'm Amir Khan in Islamabad, Pakistan, and you're watching World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Well, we're ready to continue with our conversation on closing the digital divide. Earlier on, we focused on the challenges and we heard about a range of challenges, particularly at the regulatory level. But we were also urged to think about the solutions and getting us into a new space altogether. And that's what we're going to do right now. Joining the conversation is Mohsana Garibay, who is the Minister for the Digital Economy and Entrepreneurship in Jordan. He's joined by Estelle Okofio-Sowa, who is the Regional Head for C-Squared in Ghana. And finally, there is Hui Ling Tan, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Grab in Singapore. And leading this conversation is the President of the World Bank, David Malpass.
Thank you, Lorato. In our previous panel, we talked about regulations and about how the connection there. Now we want to focus some on the need to speed up the process wherever possible. Because of COVID-19, there's an urgency to that. So I want to start with Minister Garibay. Jordan's pushing hard for private sector participation, and I wonder if you could describe the policies that you're doing to make that possible. How is that change occurring?
Thank you very much, President Malpass. And I would like to start by thanking the World Bank team in Jordan for the great support they're doing. I mean, it would not have been as easy as it is right now without their great support and presence.
Happy to hear that, Madonna. But go ahead. How do you get the private sector involved, and how can we do it fast?
Actually, I don't know if you ever heard about our story when it happens to digital divide in Jordan. We are now at 93% smartphones in Jordan. We have moved up, but to even bridge that gap, the government had decided to invest that education is not a luxury. I mean, being connected is not a luxury. It's not a privilege. It's a must. If you go digital, you need to make sure that you're inclusive and you use digitization for justice as a tool for enablement, not as a tool for exclusion. Accordingly, the government is taking social protection, including laptops and connectivity. We have done our homework. We have relied on different resources of data, and we're going to cover the gap this year. We have started the RFP to equip every vulnerable poor house in Jordan with a connected device for all the students in the country.
Let me bring in Estelle. You own and operate fiber optics, so I'm interested in how more can be built. I see that you are both in Ghana, in Uganda, in Liberia. What are the ways countries can encourage construction of fiber optics? How do they allow it to happen? What's your experience there? Thanks.
Thank you, and great to be on this panel today. Yeah, so I think one of the things that's well talked about is the impact of open access infrastructure. It's one thing to identify a right approach. It's a very different thing to implement it. One of the challenges I find on the continent is the coordination and collaboration between the public and private sector. Typically, our infrastructure has been driven by the private sector, mainly the mobile operators, but also the ISPs as well. And then you find government also coming in to invest in infrastructure. But it's often not done in collaboration and coordination with the private sector, and sometimes ends up being built where it isn't really needed, et cetera. And just it ends up being the lack of trust because of the lack of coordination. So I think one of the key things that we need to see happening is better coordination between public and private investments so that we can really utilize all the infrastructure that exists. And this is where open access and shared networks is critical because it enables every service provider. It's very CapEx intensive to invest in infrastructure. It takes a long time for you to get your returns. And that's why open access and shared networks is the best way to go. And that's what C-Squared is demonstrating in Ghana, Uganda, and Liberia.
And so does it exist equally in those three countries? And then I want to ask a kind of hard question of, would you like to be doing business in Cote d'Ivoire, let's say, or in Togo or Benin or others? Give us some comparison and who's making progress?
Yeah, so I mean, we would love to be everywhere, and that's what our mandate is on the continent. It takes time, and when you work on the continent, if you are not someone that can be patient, then you shouldn't come work here, because it does take time. And although we trumpet ease of doing business, significant improvements across the continent, it is still challenging to even get a license, right? Start operating in a country. And so it takes time to expand beyond the countries that we're in, but we would love to be across the continent. And every African continent needs open access network. That's without a doubt in my mind.
So be specific. What would cause that to happen? Is it a change of law to create open access network?
Yes, it's definitely better regulation and guidelines. And, one of the challenges we have on the continent is we often have the regulations and the policies, but it's the implementation of them and the lack of clarity around these policies and guidelines that exist. And still that lack of cohesion and trust between the policies and policymakers and regulators and the private sector. There's still a gap and a sense of almost competition where really it is our only way out is partnership, right? And when you have public investments, it results in private returns. And when you have private investments, you have public returns. It has to be a partnership, and we have to get away from the lack of trust and the sense of almost competition often that exists between what the government is doing in particularly the ICT sector and what the private sector is doing.
I want to bring in Huiling Tang from Singapore, and her company is Grab. And if I read my notes correctly, you've already raised $9 billion. So it's a huge success. You do applications, and so describe what is important in making your business run from a standpoint of connectivity.
So by way of introduction, Grab is a super app that serves Southeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia, there's 600 plus million folks here. What I mean by a super app is basically one app that has multiple services on it, everything from transportation, food deliveries, groceries deliveries, to financial services like payments, insurance, savings, and investments. So I think some critical things that are required by our platform, of course, is baseline technologies like internet connectivity that were mentioned before, smartphone capabilities, and also the ability to use this technology to connect with the underserved in villages as well as cities. So those are some of the key underlying requirements.
Will you subsidize that from profitable business? How do you think about profitability across your product line? What's the most profitable apps? And are you willing to, what would be the logic for you to subsidize those into rural areas?
So I think we strongly believe in building a sustainable, scalable platform. And there are, of course, different profitability dimensions to different services. And I will share that pre-COVID and post-COVID, they each look different. And maybe at this point, I'll share a bit about how our services have actually changed tremendously since COVID has happened. And thankfully, we've been able to help shape and support the communities that we serve during this time, because everybody is really struggling to adapt to this drastic change. And thankfully, technology platforms like smartphone capabilities and apps like Grab exist. So the key customers that we serve, for example, include just the general population, folks who need access to transportation and food deliveries. And post-COVID, what has happened is we've become from a nice-to-have service to a daily essential service, because during the lockdowns, folks could not go out and buy groceries and could not go out and go to restaurants to eat. So I struggle to think of what the world would look like today if services like Grab globally did not exist, because folks would not be able to eat and would not have been able to buy that all essential toilet paper, right? So that's one example. On the other side, we also serve our driver partners who help deliver these services. And particularly during these lockdowns, and how it's related to profitability in the different dimensions, is our transportation business got very significantly hit when cities and countries went into lockdown modes. Who would have imagined a world where streets were empty? You would only see that in Netflix videos and movies, right? So what we did was we realized that everybody's lives has significantly been impacted, and we tried to help in 2 dimensions. One, we provided, interim relief initiatives to the tune of about $40 million, where we tried to help cushion some of this economic impact via financial aid, insurance, and packages like that. We also helped to make sure that it wasn't just an interim solution. We want to make sure that they could sustain their way of living by continuing to find daily income. So we moved these driver partners from the transportation side innovatively by finding smart ways to enable them to deliver food as well. And this happened in the hundreds of thousands ranges.
So I'll try to get an interaction between you and Jordan. If Jordan makes a pitch for you to do business in Jordan, what are the questions you ask? And let me turn to Mathana. I heard the airport in Amman has reopened, and so are you a good place to do business? And should there be more apps coming into Jordan? What's the case for that? Go ahead, Mathana.
Thank you, President Melvis. Actually, I'll give you an example from Singapore. There's a Singaporean company which I visited last year, and they came to Jordan. They opened an office. They started with 20. During lockdown, they expanded to 120. We expanded 100 employees during the 2 months of the complete lockdown. And they're promising me 400 by the end of the year. They are doing that because of 3 things. Digital infrastructure was able to take all the load. Thousands of Jordanians were serving international markets from their homes efficiently and with high quality. 2, the high-skilled Jordanian youth, which have been proven through Amazon, Microsoft, Cisco, and many others, who have also expanded in employment in Jordan during global lockdown. And the good news that we have a plan for the next 5 years, which we have done with the bank, to upskill and reskill thousands of university graduates and educate hundreds of thousands of school students to digital skills and 21st century skills with proper scaling up programs with market expansions and finance expansions. The 3rd thing, the commitment and the government ecosystem. Exported services from the country are tax-free. We understand that the value brings is brought by those companies who come to Jordan and who really believe in the Jordanian youth will make a much bigger value than the tax we collect because of those revenues created in the country. And this brought us, lots of companies which we can explain further.
Estelle, is there an exciting new market in Africa that you're looking at for fiber optics? Where is change occurring?
Well, change needs to occur across the continent. I mean, most African countries today have multiple fiber optic cables landing on their coast, or if they're inland countries, crossing over their neighbors. So access to actual data and internet isn't Africa's challenge anymore. The challenge is really carrying that access from where it lands on our coast to whether it's an ATM, a security camera, a home, a business. And beyond that, the challenge then is just in people's ability to own a smart device and pay for connectivity. And that's where we, it's great for us to focus on the internet, and it's such an enabler. But our reality is still that people need to be able to generate an income to be able to pay for these things. And if I could be the president of Ghana, one of the things that would be my priority is our education system. And I think that's a huge game changer for Africa and a way for us to position ourselves in this new digital world. We have the largest number of young people anywhere in the world, and they need to be taught not what a computer is, but they need to be taught to be creators, solution creators, so that we don't just consume foreign apps and foreign content, but we rather create our own apps that will best meet our needs, and we tell our own story of all the wonderful things Africa has to offer. Unfortunately, when you go on the internet today, that isn't what you see. I've been talking recently about the recent BBC article about perhaps COVID's low numbers in Africa are because of Africa's poverty. we have to be telling the story ourselves that actually the majority of our governments got it right. They acted fast and they acted early, you know, and not that it is because of today, for once, Africa's poverty is rather being claimed to have done something good. No, we took action. We took action early. We need to tell that story ourselves. And that comes from educating people to actually use and create technology instead of just being consumers.
That's hugely important, and the connectivity is vital in that. I want to ask, Hui, are there countries that you're excited about or applications that you're excited about as far as going forward?
Yes, so I think there are two things. Firstly, Grab was created in Southeast Asia for Southeast Asia, very much like what Estelle talked about. The importance of developing localized services is really important because even though we live in one world, we're actually quite diverse. And once you look at things at a hyperlocal level, customers' needs are very different. So I think in terms of what would it take for Grab to go to Jordan, I do apologize, Minister. Nothing to do with Jordan. It's just that we're very focused on making sure that we're solving the best customers that we understand the best with the services that we believe we can bring with technology for Southeast Asia. So in terms of countries, what we're interested in is Southeast Asia. In terms of applications, I think an area called financial services is something that we're thinking a lot about right now.
What does that mean?
Financial services, whether it starts from digital payments to the concept of micro financial services, what we call the $1 revolution really matters because Southeast Asia, the majority of it is still a developing market. And because of that, approximately 70+% of the population is still underbanked. And these underserved communities are underserved because the most of the typical brick and mortar banking industry was not developed on a cost structure that would enable people in different villages who need to travel, long distances to go visit their nearest local bank work. So with applications, the internet, smartphones, what we can bring right now and what we started bringing to our users and our drivers and our merchants are things like microinsurance, where we break down big annual insurance packages into pay-per-use insurance. For example, when you're taking a car ride, instead of paying for an annual insurance protection, why don't you just pay for one for every ride that you take, which has been live on our platform for quite a while now. And we know the demand for this is real. It's not that people don't understand what insurance is or they don't want it. It's just that they can't afford it. And to date, we've sold, I think, about probably 30 million plus packages to date just on this, and it's relatively new. And we want to bring the same concept of micro insurance to micro savings to micro investments because it's
so what does the $1 mean that you just mentioned?
For each day, you can put $1 in the bank and it's going to give you returns. For each insurance package, it's going to cost you at max $1 to get travel insurance, right? That concept of breaking down something that used to cost hundreds or thousands of dollars, breaking it down into affordable chunks so that people can use it and get it when they need it, or in the quantums and sizes that they would want. That's what we call by the $1 revolution.
I'm afraid I'd have questions for all three of you for quite a while, but I'm afraid we have to wrap it up there. I want to thank you very warmly for interesting and varied perspectives on the digital gap and on how to fill it, what the solutions and innovations are in your various areas and activities. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'm Francisco Inter in Santiago de Chile, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for giving us concrete solutions and steps on how to close the digital divide. I mean, there's still time to join the conversation at all the events at these meetings using the hashtag Resilient Recovery. And if you're particularly interested in the role of the IFC, which is the bank's private sector arm, in closing the digital divide, you can learn more about them on their website. Also, the acting chief executive of the IFC, as well as the bank's vice president in charge of infrastructure, We'll be joining Paul Blake live in the atrium of the World Bank Group's headquarters straight after this event. But before that, we wanted to bring you a musical tribute to the power of staying connected. It's from a group of incredible artists here on the African continent. They actually wrote a song specially for this event. It's called Stay Connected, and it encourages Africa and Africans to embrace the spirit of togetherness. It preaches a message of unity, of hope, of assurance, positivity, synergy, and the fact that there is strength in diversity. A message that is important now more than ever. It emphasizes the importance of constant connection and collaboration, irrespective of your background, geographical barriers, or language. Take a look.
I wrote a letter the other day with a few words that I couldn't say. Yeah. It can be hard to communicate, but it is easy to demonstrate. And I know we are from different walks of life, and we have different stories.
But one thing still remains the same.
We are one, no matter different tongues or tribes. Together we can all arise. I am for you, you for me. So let's stay connected together, together, one forever. Africa will do better, together, one another. That we are one, no matter different tongues or tribes. Together we can all arise. I am for you, you are. So let's stay connected together, together, one forever. Africa will do better, together, one another. So let's stay together, together, one forever. Ensemble. Africa will do better, connect together, one another.
Live from the World Bank Atrium to our audience around the globe, I'm Paul Blake, and this is day 4 of the 2020 World Bank Group IMF annual meetings. Just a quick note on that event we just saw. Earlier this week, a new government was sworn in Jordan, and Mr. Mathana Garaibe is now the former Minister of Digital Economy and Entrepreneurship. Right, it's time to answer the questions that you've been submitting online, and to do just that, I'm joined by Stephanie von Friedeberg. She is the Interim Managing Director, Executive Vice President, as well as the Chief Operating Officer at the International Finance Corporation. That's the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, as well as Mokhtar Diop, Vice President for Infrastructure at the World Bank. Thank you so much for coming in. And Stephanie, I'll start with you. We got a question from Alicia on World Bank Live, and she wants to know, how has COVID-19 affected digital startups?
So, Paul, if there ever was a silver lining in this crisis, I might say it's technology. If you look around the globe, COVID-19 has reinforced that tech startups have this incredible ability to change our lives. And in crises, there are opportunities to be innovative and to be creative. And we've seen it with medtech, health tech, ed tech, fintech, e-commerce platforms. Specifically, maybe 3 points in our portfolio itself. First, in the startups that we've invested in, we've seen them flourish. In India, for example, we invested in Baiju, an ed tech company, 20 million new students on their platform since the start of the crisis.
That's amazing.
And Big Basket, which is an e-commerce company, had a 900% increase in orders. So that's kind of lesson number one. Lesson number two is that our startups in the portfolio have been excessively resilient. And what we've seen is they've been able to take traditional companies and pull them into the digital economy. So we invested in a company called Trade Depot in Nigeria. It's working with 40,000 micro and small retailers, traditional retailers, to keep the businesses alive and bring them onto their digital platform. And I think the third learning, and this is the most important for digital practitioners like us, is that I know Mokhtar is going to talk about digital infrastructure, so I'll leave that aside. But in addition to digital infrastructure, we need to think about the analog components that make up the digital economy. So digital skills and digital entrepreneurship, because we can't build back more resiliently without those two components together with the infrastructure.
I definitely want to ask you about digital skills here in just a second. But Mokhtar, we got a question from Basadi Edith Tamplin on World Bank Live, and they're wondering what it will take to close the digital divide between developing countries and developed countries.
A lot of things. Infrastructure, Stephanie just mentioned it, skills, policies, everything will work towards making people work together and be given services to the poorest. So what are we doing to be able to achieve all this? First of all, what Stephanie said is a reality right now. You see small companies, small startups, which are growing fast, and we are seeing more and more larger companies looking at this startup and say, yes, things are happening there, and the solution to our problem lies here. So this missing middle that we had in the digital world is shrinking in some part of the world. But in other part of the world, we are seeing this gap enlarging. So we need to close that gap. What do we need to do? We need to invest heavily in infrastructure. For that, we need to bring the private sector to continue investing in it. In Africa, for instance, we are estimating that $83 billion in CapEx and OpEx will be necessary to be able to give access to everybody. And for that, the private sector is asking us a few things. Can we talk about regulation? Can we have a level playing field? Can we look at taxation? On the consumer side, in some countries, you see access, availability of 4G or broadband, but the handsets are too expensive. So what can we do to lower the cost of this handset? By doing that, we will be able to really progressively close the bridge. Because informal sector in those countries, we rely heavily on this small handset to be able to be part of the economy. And we're seeing very interesting response. And when you look at countries like Nigeria, like Senegal, like Kenya, you see that startups are designing solutions which are very much adapted to the reality of those countries. So what will happen, most certainly, is that there will be a lot of learning for more advanced economies from the smaller economies. And that's what we are trying together to make sure that it happens.
And Stephanie, you were talking earlier about skills. The very next question for you is actually, it's from a bunch of people who have asked sort of some form of the same question. Jamil, Maura, Marino, and several other people, they want to know, what are the skills, especially in developing countries, what are the skills people need to lead in a digital economy?
So Paul, this kind of harkens back to the conversation we had yesterday and to what I said in my first intervention, which is really about those analog skill sets, digital entrepreneurship. We know that there are 3.6 billion people who aren't connected, and Mokhtar gave us the outline of how we connect those people. But many people who are connected don't have the skills to use the infrastructure that we've made available to them. And 4G and 5G infrastructure can't advance development if people don't know how to use it.
Right.
So a World Bank study from 2019 found that in Africa, across African countries, they had half of the digital skills of the global average. And yet we know that we need 230 million digitally enabled jobs in Africa by 2030. How are we going to get there? The way that I see it is an opportunity, a $130 billion opportunity to invest in the learning platforms that create the future of technology workers in Africa. So what are we doing about it? We're investing in companies like Gabeya in Ethiopia and Della in Nigeria and Kenya. These are companies that are actually teaching students to be software developers and engineers, building that skill set for the future. But in a nutshell, I would say We need to connect the world. We need to create citizens that have the skills to be able to use digital technology. And then we need to create a digital workforce that builds the technology platforms of the future.
Mokhtar, you were talking earlier about like the radio waves are there, but the handsets are too expensive. Talking about building on that, what about in communities where there isn't electricity? How can we work to include those in sort of the digital economies of the future?
Electricity, digital works very well together, and they feed each other.
Indeed.
And you are seeing now some interesting models. In the past, you will see the telco companies just providing services. Now you have a telco who come and say, I will give you a solar panel, I will give you a battery, and I will give you a connection. So you have a convergence from the two industries. We are going to the energy sector and the utility and say, you have a lot of dark fiber. You have a lot of fiber in which you invested it. Why don't you free it? Why don't you make it available to people? And we believe that by making it available, you will see a lot of ISP, a lot of providers coming on board, having more competition and increasing access. We are launching in Africa, jointly with IFC, a larger program which that I will not give you the name because we will be announcing it very soon, but which aims at making universal access to electricity in the next 10 years in Africa. That will be a lot of renewable energy. We had an initiative called Scaling Up Solar that we launched with IFC, which allow really to provide mini grids in small localities. But also we will be accelerating the connection of the main traditional grids to some regions in the country which are remote regions. So we are working very much on the two fronts. And lastly, the technology is moving in that direction. Now we talk about smart grid, smart meters. And if you don't have that technology in place and the skills that she mentioned, you will never be able to do that. For that reason, we are launching a program with UNESCO, which is called GIGA, to bring to every school in Africa a connection on internet. So kids will start learning about the skill at the earlier age and not wait until later in their life cycle.
Very careful not to scoop yourself on your forthcoming announcement here in World Bank Live. Last question to you, Stephanie. We're a financial institution. Nicholas on World Bank Live, he wanted to know how can connectivity and technology help traditionally underserved communities access finance for development?
So I think that FinTech, Paul, is probably the technology platform that is the most ubiquitous in terms of its access for people in emerging markets. And we've seen through FinTech startups that the unbanked and the underbanked are getting added to the system, and it's done in a more transparent way. But we know that there's 1.7 billion people in the world that don't have access to bank accounts. And in emerging markets, the majority of the SMEs can't get access to the finance to grow their businesses, because the brick and mortar banks can't afford to serve the clientele profitably. So this is why 20% of Africa has access to a mobile money. And in Kenya, M-Pesa has been able to lift 2% of the population out of extreme poverty. So we are seeing FinTech and FinTech startups and mobile money being able to give individuals and families financial health. That said, being a techie myself, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I look at AI and machine learning and the power that they bring to actually transform the way we make finance available to everybody around the world. And I think we've only just started. And we, as development practitioners, have an obligation to figure out how we bring that technology as inexpensively as possible to our countries of operation. And again, we need connectivity. We need citizens that have the skills to be able to use those kinds of applications. And we need the digital entrepreneurs to create the platforms that create the kind of development we're looking for.
I was in Kenya a couple of years back, and M-Pesa is everywhere. I mean, it's incredible how central it is to the economy just across the board.
And started by a telecom company.
Yeah, just incredible. Stephanie, Mokhtar, thank you guys so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
And I will tell you, I was director for
Cynthia Flores in San Jose, Costa Rica, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Well, each day this week, we're taking a trip around the world to highlight the development challenges and triumphs of individual countries. And today we've got two destinations. First up, we're taking a look at Afghanistan with Country Director Henry Karali, who spoke to my colleague Srimati Sridhar from his office in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Sri started by asking him about the bank's work in Afghanistan.
Together with the World Bank, we finance close to $4.5 billion over a 4-year period. That is the Afghanistan reconstruction cycle that we have. This has improved quite a lot of the livelihoods of people in Afghanistan. If we talk about first the reduction in infant mortality, there's a reduction in maternal mortality, but also increases in schools registration. Before the introduction of ARTF in 2001, there were only about 1 million school children registered. Now we have over 8 million. Of these, 40% are girls. So these are quite important achievements that we've been able to see. In addition, we've also been able to support women's activities, if I may stress that in particular, as we know that before the current government and before the current system of governance came in, women were discriminated against, let's be honest, and they were also disadvantaged. So today we see maybe a small number, but 21% of civil servants are women. This is continuing to improve. All of this is thanks to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund working together with IDA.
So Henry, it sounds like the trust fund is really a vital resource for the country. So tell me, what kind of continued support does it need to continue helping its citizens and create lasting impact?
ARTF works on a 3 or 4 year cycle. So donors commit funds, or at least pledge funds to the ARTF on a 3 or 4 year cycle. We are in the 4th year of the current cycle, which means by December 2020, the current cycle will come to an end. And so what is needed next is another round of pledging, which we do have a conference that is jointly hosted by the Afghanistan government and the Finland government, which will be held in Geneva in November. And we are looking forward to further pledges to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. On top of that, the World Bank, through IDA, does provide about $1.3 billion for the current IDA 19 cycle. So together with the donors, we hope to be able to replenish the ARTF and continue supporting Afghanistan in that context. As I mentioned earlier, there is still a lot to be done in education, in the health sector, in supporting the poor, and of course, in infrastructure, including water and agriculture as well.
So Henry, let's place all of this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is affecting all of us on a global level right now. Countries have had to respond rapidly and in their own unique ways. Now, for Afghanistan, which has more vulnerable citizens, I mean, what has been the impact of this virus on the country?
Unfortunately, Afghanistan has suffered quite significantly. Let's start with the general numbers that we all talk about. We have seen this year, 2020, contraction of the economy by between 5.5% to 7.5%. That is quite significant for a country that is already poor. Population is continuing to grow with refugees coming back. So in effect, the GDP per capita will shrink. On top of that, we've had a reduction in remittances, which is quite a useful source of income for the poor, mainly from migrant labor working in neighboring countries. This has had a major impact with the reduction in numbers employed in the neighboring countries. And then finally, of course, there was the direct impact of measures taken to control COVID, like lockdowns. There were also measures taken by neighboring countries closing borders. And so COVID overall has had quite a negative impact on the economy and more directly on the people of Afghanistan. What the bank has done is to finance a health sector emergency project, which will provide supplies for fighting the COVID-19 disease, and also other projects for agriculture to ensure food security. And then finally, we are providing budget support to the tune in total of all of these close to $1 billion. The World Bank, together with ARTF partners, are providing for Afghanistan due to COVID.
So then, Henry, I mean, what do you think is going to be the biggest priority for Afghanistan as it looks to recover from the pandemic?
I think first and foremost is to protect the poor, because when you have instances where you have lockdowns, then the people who suffer the most are the poor, because they don't have savings, they are not able to work from home. Most of them are daily wage workers, which means hand-to-mouth kind of existence. And so someone has to step in and provide at least the minimum amount of support, either in cash or in kind food, for families to be able to survive through this process. Then the second thing in the medium term is to strengthen food production, which is what we are doing through the agriculture project. We have a $200 million water project as well. All of these are really meant to establish an environment where the smallholder farmers, who constitute 70% of the population, will be able to survive, but also to produce food. So we are killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Improving the agriculture system, improving the distribution system, and also improving the irrigation and water supply systems to ensure that these projects in the end will be successful.
Absolutely. Certainly a lot of very crucial priorities. Now, for my last question here, I do want to switch gears a little bit, Henry, and ask you, what gives you hope when you think about the work that you do?
Perhaps the biggest hope is looking back and seeing that despite all the challenges, despite all the conflict, despite even COVID, Afghanistan has actually seen some development gains. I talked about the reduction in child mortality. I talked about the reduction in maternal mortality, and also the increase in schools. But there are also others, like the increase in mobile penetration, the increase in connection to electricity, the increase in access to markets. All of these are positive steps. Small they may be, but they're positive steps that are helping Afghanistan move along the way. If you actually look at the number of, the percentage of the population that is connected to grid electricity, it is close to 40%. If you add to that the percentage of the population that has solar power, then it's close to 99%. That is a surprise, because in a country that is afflicted by conflict, you would not expect such high numbers. So that's where the hope comes from, that despite all the challenges, Afghanistan is able to continue improving and develop. Slow, but sure.
Henry, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sri, and it's been a pleasure for me, especially knowing that we're doing this for the people of Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
That was Henry Karali, the country director for Afghanistan.
Well, before we continue our journey around the world, let's check in with Pabsi Mariano, who's been pulling the results of today's poll. Pabsi, we've been asking people what's most needed to close the digital divide. People have been voting. What have they said?
So before I reveal the top results, let's go through the choices. Investments in infrastructure, technological innovation, better policies and regulations, and digital skills. So with 5,845 total votes across all our platforms and all languages, top answer is investments in infrastructure with 44% of the votes.
Infrastructure seems to be what most people think is needed. All right. So we've talked a lot about questions, comments that are coming in online. Probably my favorite project we're doing this week is the digital mosaic. It's where people are submitting photos. I think we have an image of it now queued up. hopefully that's coming up now, then we can show some folks. And for those who aren't aware, this is our collective art project. People around the world are contributing photos, showing us all what resilience means to them. For me, I added a photo a few days back from my first day back in this building, and I was super excited to be back. It's something I'd been looking forward to for several months. But you and your team have been reviewing the various contributions. Tell me about some that have sort of stood out to you.
So a lot of people are actually relating to all our key events. For example, many have submitted about investing in women and girls. And that was discussed earlier as well from the CEO of the Girls Who Code. So that's very relatable to and relevant to what we're talking about the whole week. And then a lot of people have also shared about how their community is helping each other in this time of COVID-19. So a lot of supporting healthcare workers and other, people in the front lines. And lastly, I think a lot of people are also submitting their stories about seeing resilience in their children. And I think that's a little bit poetic and just tugs your heart a little bit. So I would encourage everybody to check out the submissions in the Mosaic.
And that's at live.worldbank.org/mosaic. And the cool thing is you see the whole thing there, and then you can click in and sort of zoom in and see the little individual photos.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll be back here tomorrow in about 24 hours to reveal the sort of final image that's made up. But it's time to continue our journey around the world. Our next stop is Bangui in the Central African Republic, and that's where Country Director Hans Freiters spoke to Srimati Sridhar about the bank's work in the CAR.
So maybe first about the Central African Republic. As the name says, it lies in the center of Africa, right smack in the middle of Africa. One of the consequences of that is that it was colonized very late. And so it has been having a history of being by itself for a long time, but there have always been invaders or colonizers and later on rulers that have actually only been interested mostly not in its population, but in its natural resources, which are in abundance: gold, diamond, forest. You could say it's a country that's trapped in a resource trap, as they say. And so right now there's a peace accord, for example, but in reality this really is a fragile equilibrium between 14 armed groups that are still competing for those resources and a state that's not able to control and govern in the entirety of its country. So that's a little bit the situation of the country, and in such a situation, who suffers? It's the population who suffers. So life expectancy is 52, half of the people are food insecure, malnutrition for about 40% of the people. If you go to school as a kid, you can expect to go to school for no more than 5 years. And then the country was recently destroyed in 2013-14 by 2 civil wars, which has left the country devastated, the population traumatized. So that's a little bit of the context in which we need to work. And so what's our role then there as the World Bank? So first of all, of course, you have a peacekeeping force. Blue Helmets is a large peacekeeping force, so that's an important element that's there. And then have humanitarians who substitute the services of the government where the government is not capable of delivering those. And then we are in there as development actor. That means we work for the long haul, long-term development. When the peacekeeping forces and the humanitarian forces are not needed anymore, development actors will still be there, and we work towards that moment through the government, with the government, to build their capacity. But of course, what we need to do is work closely with these peacekeeping forces and these humanitarian actors. And that's so central and core to our strategy for fragile and conflict-affected countries, is that we work on this continuum of security, humanitarian, and development action. And that's essential to our approach here in CER.
Can you give us a specific example of what the bank group is doing in the Central African Republic?
Yeah, so now COVID-19 has given us many examples. So what was really interesting to see about this crisis, COVID-19, is that the cliche says that in every crisis there's an opportunity, but it's actually true. So the situation that CAR was facing, like many other countries, is that it was competing for protective gear, for gloves, etc., on an international market. And you just imagine if even developed countries couldn't get these things in their country, what about CER? No way. So when the president decided that mandatory wearing of masks, as many other countries have done, would also have to be applied in CER, so the only option really was to think of a way of creating those masks in the country itself. Artisanal masks, right? So the solution the country came up, and together with us, because we restructured the bank project for that, was to really make contracts with small enterprises, right? Couturier, small enterprises that would be fabricating those masks. And 4 months later, in a period of 4 months, because one would always say that in a low capacity country like CR, it's impossible to do something like that. But 4 months later, 10 million masks were produced. And this was done through contracts with 360 small enterprises that usually work in informality, but now had an opportunity to work on something that is actually has been building up an entire value chain. They always say in low capacity countries, value chains are a problem, but we actually developed a value chain from the prime materials all the way up to a quality control mechanism for these masks. So this was quite interesting because this one solution was not only the cornerstone of the health response, it was also the cornerstone of the socioeconomic response because it was injecting through jobs more than $10 million in sometimes very conflicted areas of the country that had never seen any peace dividend. And it was also a private sector development project, really the experience of building up a whole value chain. So it was quite inspiring and energizing for this country. And it boosts also the morale because this is a story that's now going around the world already for a few weeks. And so those things give a morale boost to a country that's always labeled as low capacity. And we should not underestimate the impact of that as well.
Well, what a huge success. And speaking of other big ticket items, there are crucial elections coming up for the Central African Republic. And just recently, the bank group approved a new partnership framework for the country. So tell us, what are the priorities for the Central African Republic going forward?
So the first priority is to continue on the path towards stabilization and out of fragility. That's absolutely the first priority, and everyone needs to help to get this done. And these elections are crucial in that respect because we now have had 4 years of a normal government with whom international parties have been able to work. So now going through elections without violence in a climate of normalcy, if you want, and go to a next government that we can also work with, that suddenly puts the country on an 8-year trajectory out of fragility and conflict towards stabilization. So that's priority number one. And what's quite innovative about our IDA envelope, our IDA 19 envelope that we just approved, is that we are actually linking the availability of resources towards to the government's commitment towards peace and stability. So if these elections take place in a good climate, then more IDA resources will become available. If the peace accords becomes implemented, more IDA resources become available. And we've agreed on that with the country. So our resources for long-term development become linked to the country's commitment to that long-term development and stability. It's quite innovative framework that IDA 19 has given us. And then, of course, what do the resources go to? Obviously, we need to invest in the people, education and health, connectivity, roads and energy. So the basic stuff around service delivery, that people can move and can be safe and have an education and health. And then financial management, governance of the country, and eventually the country needs to start to develop a private sector so that the government can develop and increase its own resources and depend less on donors. In all that, I think there's some important cross-cutting areas of priority. One is women. The suffering of women and girls in this country is unspeakable. So we need to protect women, and some of our resources need to go to that, but also help them become the motor, the engine of development, because they certainly have that potential. And in such a wide country with poor connectivity, we need to think about the digital agenda and see if we can leapfrog some of the problems by investing in digital. I think those are the key priorities for the country.
Absolutely. Certainly a lot to unpack here going forward. I mean, for this last question here, Han, I mean, tell me, what inspires you as you work in the Central African Republic and in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's certainly not always an easy place to work. So the challenges are huge, but of course that in itself is inspiring. What I do think that drives me most is we work here in a country where the role of the World Bank is very important. It's critically important. We are not some sideshow or we are really at the center of the debate. We are the core drivers of the long-term development efforts of this country. And so the feeling, and I think that drives many people, and it maybe drives all human beings, like the feeling that you can have an impact with how you work with people and the kinds of decisions you take, that's very empowering, and that's empowering to me as well, and that is what really drives me in the end.
That's great. Han, thank you so much for joining me here today and telling us more about the Central African Republic.
It's my pleasure. Good luck.
I am Shegufta Shahriyar in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and you are watching World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Back live in Washington with Pabsi Mariano. Pabsi, we're coming to the end of day 4. What's on tap for tomorrow?
So tomorrow is End Poverty Day. So at 10 a.m. Eastern Time or 1400 GMT, we're highlighting the urgency of fighting global poverty, particularly in the light of the setbacks caused by COVID-19. So, Paul, that's a very crucial conversation.
Definitely, and that'll be our 5th and final event. All these events are available for replay. How do people watch them back if they missed any of them?
Yes, so please go to World Bank Live to watch all the replays of the events if you've missed them, as well as go to our YouTube channel where we have our playlist there, and we will have 10-minute session highlights for each event.
Sort of highlight reel, the best of bits.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Pabsi. Well, that's it for day 4 of the 2020 World Bank Group IMF annual meetings. I do hope you'll join me, Pabsi, and our expert guests tomorrow from 10 a.m. Eastern, that's 1400 GMT, here on World Bank Live as we mark End Poverty Day. In the meantime, you can explore all this week's events and activities, as Pabsi said, at live.worldbank.org. Until tomorrow, though, goodbye.
From Mexico City.
In Athens, Greece.
In Lome, Togo.
from Mexico City.
In Athens, Greece.
In Lome, Togo.